In regards to the drawings that I did in response to the Daniel Bartlam research that I did, I obviously drew a portrait of him which was based on reference from his mugshot because there were very few photos of him that I could draw from. And within the photos, his mouth was really thin, so I decided to literally just have his mouth as a line. And also, in the very few photos that I did see of him, he was smiling the majority of the time. So that's why I drew him smiling, and then emphasised that further by adding lines around the mouth just to present the dimples. And then within the photographs, I also spotted that he had very slight moustache hair, and so I incorporated that too by adding lines above his upper lip, which I feel also shows his age as well, because he was 14 when he murdered his mother. And so by adding a little bit of moustache hair, I feel that it shows that he is pubescent. And then he also had very deep set eyes as well as really emphasised under eye bags. So I decided to emphasise those by creating lines beneath the eyes, and then I added more lines just to further emphasise his eye bags. And then his hair was quite short, but he did have somewhat of a fringe, so I just represented that by following the outline of his head and then doing zigzag strokes to represent strands of hair. So with the drawings of the 2 pairs of underwear, I decided to draw this because one of the main abnormal factors with Daniel Bartlam's childhood was the fact that when he was on a quest to gain his mother's attention after her divorce and after she just wasn't paying attention to him, he decided to steal her underwear, which she later on found them but then just laughed it off, whereas he wanted a retaliation, he wanted some form of attention from her. Obviously, a lot of people, when you explain that he did steal his mother's underwear, they assume that it's because he was sexually attracted to his mother, and so he stole his mother's underwear for sexual gratification. But when you compare it to other aspects of his life, you see that the amount of times that he would rebel in order to get some form of attention, even if it was bad, from his mother, he would do anything just to have her present with him. And then I also decided to make the underwear feminine just to signify that they were in fact his mother's. So I did this by adding eyelashes and also large full lips, because in a lot of cartoons women are represented with large full lips. And also, in order to make the underwear more feminine, I decided to add bits of lace as well as small bows. And then another abnormal aspect that I had discovered from my research into Bartlam, I had found that he was urinating and defecating into plastic tubs in his room, which obviously this is really strange, and so obviously I felt like I had to challenge myself and somehow represent it. So I did this by just drawing a basic tub and then adding 2 pieces of poo inside of the tub to obviously represent defecation. And these were basically referenced by the poo emoji that's used on an iPhone. because otherwise I couldn't really think of a cartoon, more simplified way to represent it. So I just use the same curved lines that are within a poo emoji because I feel that it's something that a lot of people recognise. And then I decided to turn the tub into a character, and I decided to have the character as being fed up because obviously he's filled with feces. So in that respect, it is somewhat humorous in the way that I've presented it. And so I was able to make the character look fed up by having his eyelids showing, because based on my cartoon research, I'd observed that when characters are either tired or disappointed or fed up, it's represented by having a mouth that is often a straight line or a slight frown, as well as eyelids that are half shut. And so I used that research and incorporated it within this particular drawing. And then I decided to also draw the hammer because I feel that this is one of the most significant aspects within Bartlam's life, because this was in fact the murder weapon that he used to murder his mother. So I decided to take a claw hammer from the Art Foundation department and I used that as reference. So in a sense this is somewhat a life drawing, but whilst I was drawing it I decided to simplify it by having just the handle as essentially a long stick, and then really simplifying the claw part of the hammer just into two small strips at the back, and then having the head of the hammer just as an oval shape, so that you could still tell that it was a hammer, but it wasn't represented realistically. It was in more of a cartoon style. And I feel that this process was a lot easier and it was a lot quicker because of my previous Elizabeth Murray inspired drawings, because from those I'd practiced looking at objects and then simplifying them and turning them into cartoons. And so because of that previous process, I was able to do this process a lot quicker and it was a lot easier for me. So I'm glad that I decided to experiment with Elizabeth Murray's style of drawing. Finally, I decided to draw a laptop because although when you first look at it, it doesn't specifically look abnormal because it's just a laptop, but when it's put into the context in which it was used for, it's something that's a lot more disturbing. So essentially when Bartlam's parents divorced, his dad decided to buy him a new computer. And then following this, Bartlam exposed himself to really violent media, and then also increasingly became obsessed with Coronation Street, and in particular with Coronation Street, it was the character called John Stape, who was a serial killer. And so this exposure that Daniel had to violent media definitely, I feel, was one of the catalysts for him to commit that crime. And then also with the laptop, it's important because it was one of the main pieces of evidence that exposed Bartlam, because essentially when he'd murdered his mom, he was obsessed with getting away with the crime, because with the John Stape storyline, the serial killer managed to get away with the crime for quite some time. And so Bartlam became obsessed with being able to get away with the crime. And so this led him to start writing a play which had a very similar plot to the John Stape story within Coronation Street. But the characters were changed so that Daniel Bartlam was John Stape, the serial killer, and the victim was his mother. And so, even though he deleted the files on his laptop, police were obviously still able to find the files, and so that was just one of the main things that essentially that he'd exposed to the police, that he had in fact murdered his own mom. With the presentation of the laptop, I decided to keep it really simple because I felt that the vast amount of keys that are on a laptop, I felt that it would look just too overcrowded. So I decided to just draw the numerical side of the keyboard, which is numbers 1 to 9, and then I decided to separate that and then draw the letters, which is essentially just a series of lines. Because I didn't really want the focus to be on the keys, I wanted it to be on the actual screen of the laptop itself. And then with the presentation of the face of the laptop, I decided that I wanted it to purposefully look angry to show the violent media that Bartlam was exposing himself to, as well as his disturbing play that he wrote on his laptop. So I decided to look at Becky Sloan's and Joseph Pelling's Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, number 4, because I previously watched it and had remembered that there was a computer character, and so I thought that I could gain some sort of inspiration for that. And I found it really interesting how all the other characters had curved features so that they purposefully fit the curved faces that they were placed on, whereas the computer, it was represented as being very rigid and the shapes used were square or rectangular. And I'd observed that this is obviously because with technology there is that whole aesthetic where shapes are much more rigid and sharper, and also the fact that pixels, as they are square, it makes sense that the face of the computer would be also square and therefore made of the pixels. From this, I decided to have the eyes square. I decided to have the eyes rectangular with the pupils also rectangular, and then also dark so that you could distinguish the difference between the eye and the pupil itself. And then in terms of the mouth, I looked at, and with the mouth I decided to draw a more rigid version of a frown, which is normally curved. So I decided to do this by just drawing 2 lines vertical and 1 horizontal so that it mimics the shape of a frown, but obviously it's presented in a more rigid way to convey the fact that it is a laptop. And then with the eyebrows, I also turned them inwards and then had them facing downwards, because obviously, as I've said before, in a lot of cartoons, anger and frustration is represented through diagonal brows,